The chains were too tight. Serafina Vale noticed that before anything else. Not the cold stone beneath her bare feet, not the iron collar around her neck, not the sound of heavy boots echoing down the corridor ahead of her. The chains were the first thing, biting into her wrists like something that had been waiting a long time to hold her. She kept her head up anyway. She had learned long ago that dropping your head was an invitation. It told people that you already believed whatever they were about to say about you. The guards who had found her at the eastern border of Iron Fang territory were not gentle men. They were not cruel either, not in the way that enjoyed it. They were simply efficient, the way soldiers were when they had done the same job too many times. One of them had grabbed her arm without a word. The other had clapped the restraints on before she had finished saying her name. Now, they walked her through a corridor that seemed to have no end, and neither of them had spoken since they left the border checkpoint. Serafina counted the torches on the wall. It gave her something to do. 11, 12, 13. She had been walking for 3 days before they found her. 3 days across open land that smelled like pine needles and old rain, sleeping under trees, eating what she found along the way. She had not eaten anything in the last day and a half. Her legs were tired in a deep way, the kind of tired that lived in the bones and not just the muscles. But she kept her stride even. She kept her chin level. The village of Crestmere had been gone for 6 days. She did not let herself think about that, not yet. There was no room for it here, in this corridor, with these chains on her wrists and these guards at her sides. Grief was a thing she would allow herself later, in private, somewhere safe, if she ever found somewhere safe again. For now she simply walked, and counted torches, and kept her breathing steady. The corridor opened without warning into a hall so large that the ceiling was lost in shadow. Serafina stopped breathing for a moment. She had grown up in Crestmere, a village of roughly 400 people, where the biggest building was the meeting hall, and even that creaked when the wind blew hard from the north. This was something different entirely. The floor was pale stone, smooth and cold, and it stretched ahead of her like a field. The walls were carved, not decorated, carved, in the way that said the people who built this place had not been thinking about beauty, but about permanence. About the idea that whatever stood here would outlast every other thing in the known world. There were people lining both sides of the hall. She had not expected that. She had expected an interrogation room, perhaps, a holding cell, a desk with an official sitting behind it, asking her questions in a bored voice. She had not expected an audience. But here they were, men and women standing in rows on either side of the long central aisle, dressed in clothing that probably cost more than Crestmere's entire annual grain supply. Some of them looked at her with open curiosity, some with contempt, some with the careful blankness of people who had learned to keep their reactions hidden. The guard at her right nudged her forward. Serafina walked. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a low platform, was a throne. It was not golden. She had expected gold, but it was black stone, carved from something that looked like it had been pulled directly from a mountainside without apology. And in the throne sat a man. She had heard the name Calum Drace before. Everyone had. You did not live within 3 kingdoms of Iron Fang territory without hearing the name at least once, attached to some story or another. The stories varied in their details, but they agreed on the important points. That he was young for a king, that he had taken the throne at 18, after a period that no one described in specific terms, and that since taking it, he had expanded Iron Fang's borders 4 times, ended 2 wars, and started 1. And that in all that time, no one had ever seen him act out of anything but complete deliberate control. He looked like the stories. That was the first thing she thought. He was tall even sitting, broad in the shoulders, with the build of someone who had not simply inherited power, but had worked very physically to understand it. His hair was dark, cut short. His eyes, she discovered when she was close enough to see them clearly, were silver, not gray. Silver, the way certain metal looked in moonlight. He was watching her with an expression that gave away nothing at all. She stopped at the base of the platform. The guard to her left cleared his throat. "Alpha King," he said. "This is the trespasser, apprehended at the eastern border checkpoint. No identification, no pack marking, no wolf scent." She refused to explain her presence. Serafina blinked. "I did not refuse," she said. "I explained it twice. Both times to men who had already decided what they believed." There was a sharp intake of breath somewhere in the hall. The guard at her left went very still. Serafina kept her eyes on the man in the throne, Calum Drace had not moved. He was still watching her with that same unreadable expression. She could not tell if he was surprised or annoyed or something else entirely. His fingers rested loosely on the arms of the throne. He was very still, in the way that large, confident things were still, not because nothing was happening inside, but because nothing happening inside was urgent enough to show on the outside. "You have a name," he said. It was not a question. "Seraphina Vale," she said. "And what brings Seraphina Vale to my border without permission, without identification, and without the courtesy of announcing herself?" "I was not aware," she said carefully, "that a person running from the destruction of their home needed to announce themselves before seeking safety." Another ripple through the hall, quieter this time, more considered. Calum looked at her for a moment longer, then leaned back very slightly. "Where are you from?" "Crestmere, a village on the eastern edge of the Pale Reaches." "Crestmere was destroyed 6 days ago," said a voice from the side of the room. Seraphina turned her head. A man stood near the wall, older, with close-cropped silver hair, and the expression of someone who had spent his career organizing difficult information. He held a leather folder in one hand. "Confirmed by our border reports. Rogue attack. No survivors listed." "I survived," Seraphina said. "So you claim." "So I know. There is a difference." She heard, very distinctly, a sound from somewhere in the rows of onlookers. It took her a moment to understand that it was a suppressed sound of amusement. She did not look to find the source. Calum's silver eyes had not moved from her face. "You carry no scent," he said. "No wolf, no pack affiliation, no markings. You arrive at my border with nothing but the clothes you're wearing, and a story about a destroyed village." "Yes," she said, "that is correct." "And you want what, exactly? Shelter, food, passage through?" "Shelter," she said. "Somewhere to stay while I work out what comes next. I do not ask for charity. I can work for what I need. I have useful skills." "What skills?" "I can read. I can write. I can keep records, tend livestock, cook, build basic structures, and treat common injuries and illness. I have been doing all of these things since I was 8 years old." She paused. "I am also, as you have now seen, reasonably good at not being frightened in rooms where most people would be frightened." This time the sound from the rows was more definite, more than one person. Even a few of the nobles closer to the throne seemed to shift very slightly, as though something had loosened in the room. Calum Drace did not laugh, but something in his expression moved. It was very small, barely the tightening of a muscle near his jaw, or perhaps a slight change in the set of his eyes. She could not have described it precisely. It was there, and then it was not. "Take her to the holding chambers," he said to the guards, and stood. The hall immediately straightened, backs going rigid, attention snapping to him in a way that was too unified to be accidental. It had been drilled into them. "I will review the border reports and her story will be investigated. She remains here until I have a complete picture." The guards moved. Seraphina did not resist. There was no point in resisting, and more importantly, she had not yet given up on the possibility that this would work out. She was tired and hungry, and her wrists ached, and her village was ash on the eastern wind, but she had not given up. She did not know how to give up. Crestmere had been a hard place, where seasons were unpredictable, and resources were not guaranteed, and the people who had raised her had taught her many things, but helplessness was not among them. As the guards turned her and walked her back down the long aisle, she heard the hall filling again with the sound of voices, low and layered, the way voices sounded when people were being careful about what they said. She counted the torches again on the way out. 13, 12, 11. The holding chambers were cleaner than she expected, not comfortable, bare, cool, with a narrow cot against one wall, and a small window near the ceiling that let in a thin strip of afternoon light, but clean. Someone had placed a bowl of water on the small shelf near the door, and when the guards removed her chains and left, she went to it immediately, and drank without embarrassment. Then she sat on the edge of the cot, and allowed herself, for exactly 3 minutes, to feel everything she had been holding back. Crestmere, the smell of the smoke, the sound that had woken her, deep in the night, which had not been anything she could name, but which her body had understood before her mind did. The way she had run, not toward anything, just away, because sometimes away was the only direction available. She had heard other people running too, in the dark, but she had not found any of them, and the fire had moved faster than running. She had looked back only once. She did not think about what she had seen when she looked back. 3 minutes. Then she folded it all up and set it aside, because that was what you did when you needed to survive. Grief was real, and it was important, and it would have to be felt fully, eventually, but not yet. Not here. Not until she was somewhere that survival was no longer the primary concern. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The Alpha King had silver eyes and the stillness of something that had learned to wait. He had not been kind to her, but he had not been cruel either. He had listened, genuinely listened, she thought. She had watched enough conversations in her life to know the difference between a person who was waiting for their turn to speak and a person who was actually processing what was being said. He had processed it. Whatever he decided to do with it was another matter. She thought about the way the hall had reacted to her, the way the rows of people had shifted and murmured when she spoke plainly. She had not done it to impress anyone. She had done it because she did not have the energy to be anything other than direct, and because she had found, over the years, that a certain kind of fear dressed itself up as aggression, and the most disarming response to aggression was calm. She wondered if he would let her stay. She suspected he would not. She was nothing to this place. No name, no rank, no wolf. A girl from a village that was already being described in past tense by men with leather folders. The sensible decision, from a king's point of view, was to move her along, give her a meal, perhaps a small sum of coin, and send her toward the nearest city with a polite but firm farewell. She could work with that, she decided. She had worked with less. Outside, through the small high window, the sky was turning the particular shade of deep orange that meant the sun was about 20 minutes from disappearing entirely. She tracked it as it moved. She was good at tracking light. In Crestmere, knowing what hour of day it was had been a practical skill, because the days had been organized around the light rather than around clocks. She heard voices in the corridor outside her door. Not the guards. Different voices, higher and faster and carrying the specific energy of people who were arguing about something they thought was important. She caught fragments. No wolf, no pack, no business here. Border reports said Crestmere was fully. Not our concern what happened in the Pale Reaches. She did not hear the rest, because they moved past her door, and their voices faded down the corridor. But she had heard enough to understand that she was already a subject of conversation in this place, and not in a comfortable way. She closed her eyes. She was not afraid, exactly, but she was very aware that she was alone, in a way that she had not been since she was a small child, completely alone, without a community to return to, without even the small and complicated comfort of a place that knew her name. Seraphina Vale, 22 years old. No wolf, no pack, no home. She had slept in worse places. She had eaten less than this. She had woken up in harder situations and found a way to move forward because there was no other option, and because the alternative to moving forward was simply not one she was willing to consider. She breathed in. She breathed out. Outside, the last light faded from the small high window, and the holding chamber grew dark, and somewhere deep in the palace above her, the Alpha King of Ironfang was reading border reports and thinking about her, and she did not know it yet, but neither did he know what that thinking meant, or what it would cost him, or what it would eventually give him in return. She slept, and somewhere, in the vast and complex machinery of fate, something very old and very patient turned 1 degree further toward its destination. The next morning arrived the way mornings did, in places without warmth, sudden and gray, the light coming through the small window, like something that had not made up its mind yet. Seraphina was awake before it fully arrived. She had always been an early riser. In Crestmere, the animals did not wait for people to feel ready. She sat up, rolled her shoulders, and assessed her situation with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything. Physically, tired, but functional, hungry. The bowl of water from the previous evening had been accompanied, sometime in the night, by a tray slid under the door, bread and dried fruit, and a small wedge of hard cheese. Not generous, but not nothing. She had eaten it immediately upon finding it, and felt better for it. Emotionally, contained. The 3 minutes she had allowed herself the evening before had done their work. She was not numb. She knew the difference between numbness and managed composure, but she was steady. She stood and moved to the door and tried it. Locked. She had expected that. She went back to the cot and sat cross-legged and began to think about what she knew and what she did not know and what she could do about the difference. What she knew: she was inside the Iron Fang Palace, held in a room that was clean but locked, having been brought before the Alpha King and heard, really heard. She knew she had made some kind of impression, though what kind was difficult to determine. She knew the court was divided on her. She had heard enough in the corridor to understand that. She knew the official from the side of the hall, the silver-haired man with the leather folder, was likely someone whose opinion carried weight, and she knew he was skeptical. What she did not know, what Calum Drace had decided, or would decide, whether anyone in the court would speak on her behalf. Unlikely, since no one knew her. Whether the investigation into her story would confirm it, or contradict it. Whether she would walk out of this place on her own terms, or in chains again. What she could do: wait. Answer questions honestly when they came. Not perform fear. Not perform anything, actually. She had found that performance was generally counterproductive when dealing with people who were accustomed to reading other people. She would simply be what she was, and let it stand. It was not a comfortable plan, but it was the only honest one available. The door opened at mid-morning. Not a guard this time. A young woman, in plain working clothes, carrying a tray with an actual meal on it. Warm food this time. Some kind of grain porridge with what looked like honey drizzled over the top, and a cup of something hot that smelled like pine and herbs. She set it down on the shelf without speaking. "Thank you," Serafina said. The woman paused. She looked maybe 17, with a serious face and dark braided hair. She glanced at Serafina quickly, then away. "You spoke back to the king yesterday," she said, very quietly, as though the words were being said without her full permission. "I answered his questions," Serafina said. "I did not speak back to him." The young woman looked at her again. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. Then she left, and the door locked again behind her. Serafina ate the porridge. The honey was real. That was a detail she noticed and filed away, not because it mattered strategically, but because real honey in a holding chamber meant something about how this place operated. It meant someone had thought about it. Possibly that was standard practice here. Possibly it was deliberate. Either way, it was information. She was halfway through the cup of hot pine and herb drink when she heard footsteps in the corridor that sounded different from the other footsteps she had been cataloging since she arrived. Heavier, more deliberate. Fewer of them, but carrying more weight somehow. Not in terms of physical sound, but in terms of intention. The door opened. Calum Drace walked in without preamble, alone, and stood in the middle of the small room, and looked at her. He was not in throne room clothes. He wore simpler things. Dark, practical, well-made but not decorated. He was still tall. She had noticed that yesterday, but it was more apparent here, in a room with a ceiling that was only a foot or so above his head. He looked at the tray, then at her, then at the wall, then back at her. He was doing his own assessment. She let him do it. "Your story checks out," he said. "I know," she said. It was true. He looked at her steadily. Crestmere was confirmed destroyed. Rogue pack, Eastern origin. We've been tracking them for 3 months. He paused. There were 11 survivors. You were not among the names we had. I did not stay to give anyone my name, she said. I ran. 11 survivors, he said again. 63 dead. The number landed on her like a physical thing. She breathed through it. I did not know the number, she said quietly. I did not look back long enough to count. Something in his face shifted. Very briefly. Then it settled back into the careful stillness he wore like a second layer of skin. He looked away from her for a moment, at the small window near the ceiling. The gray morning light fell across the side of his face. You have no family left? He asked. My parents died 4 years ago, she said. Winter illness. I have a cousin somewhere in the Thornfield region, but we have not been in contact for 2 years. She paused. I was not alone in Crestmere, though. The village was my community, if not my blood family. He was quiet for a moment. What did you mean yesterday, he said, when you said you had useful skills? And so she told him again, in the same plain terms she had used in the throne room. But here, in this small room, without the audience, without the performance of it, it sounded different, more real. She described the records she had kept for the village council, the livestock management, the medical knowledge she had picked up from the village healer, who had been a woman named Orla, precise and patient and exacting, who had taught her that understanding how something worked was always more useful than simply memorizing what to do with it. He listened. He was very good at listening. She noticed that again here, the way she had noticed it yesterday, the quality of his attention, which was not passive but active, processing rather than simply waiting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I have 1,200 people in this palace complex," he said. "Staff, guards, officials, residents. My records master is overwhelmed. My medical ward is understaffed, because 2 of my healers left for the capital city 2 months ago, and the replacements have not arrived." He looked at her. "I am not offering you charity." "I did not ask for charity," she said. "I am telling you that if you work, there is a place for you here. Temporary, until you can determine what your situation requires." He said it in the same tone he probably used for administrative decisions, clean and declarative, without warmth or its absence. Just fact. You would be housed, fed, and paid a working wage. If at any point the arrangement is no longer suitable to either party, it ends. Serafina looked at him. She thought about it honestly, not quickly, not with enthusiasm or suspicion, but honestly. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as though something had been filed. "Someone will come to show you to the staff quarters. You begin tomorrow." He turned to leave. "Alpha King," she said. He stopped. "Why?" she asked. "You could have sent me along with a meal and coin. It would have been simpler." He was quiet for a moment with his back still to her. Then he said, without turning around, "I am not always looking for simpler." And he left. Serafina sat with that for a moment. Then she finished her pine and herb drink, which had gone slightly cool, and began to think about what came next. She did not know, sitting there in that clean bare room on the second morning of her new and unrecognizable life, that she had just made a decision that would eventually rewrite everything. She did not know that the man who had just offered her a practical arrangement in a flat administrative tone had gone home to his own chambers afterward and stood at the window looking out at his territory for a long time without being able to explain why. She only knew that she had somewhere to be tomorrow morning. For now, that was enough. The staff quarters were on the western side of the palace complex, a long building connected to the main structure by a covered walkway that was plain and functional and smelled like wood smoke and soap. The woman who showed her to her room was named Petra, and she was direct in a way that Serafina immediately respected. She pointed to things as they walked and named them without elaboration. Dining hall, laundry room, medical supply room, records room, her own room. The room was small but private, which was more than Serafina had expected. A bed with a real mattress, a small table, a chair, and a window that faced east. In Crestmere, she had shared a sleeping space with the cousin, who had eventually moved away, and before that with her parents. She had not had a room of her own since she was 8 years old. She sat on the edge of the mattress, and pressed her palms against it, and felt the slight give of it, and thought that this, at least, was something. "You start in records tomorrow," Petra said from the doorway. "Reports master is Aldrich Vane. He will not be warm about it, but he will tell you what to do. Do not be late." "I am never late," Serafina said. Petra looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, in the same flat way that the Alpha King had nodded, and Serafina wondered if it was a palace habit, or simply a trait, that efficient people shared. "Dinner is at 6, Petra said. "Do not miss it, or you will not eat until morning." She left. Serafina lay back on the bed, and stared at the ceiling of her new room, and listened to the sounds of the palace settling around her. Distant voices, the clank of something metal somewhere, the rhythmic sound of boots on stone in the corridor. A place with its own heartbeat. A place that had been running before she arrived, and would keep running, whether she stayed or not. She fit herself into that thought, found the edges of it. She was not afraid of being small in a large thing. She had been small in Crestmere too, not unimportant, but one person among many, doing her part. That was familiar. That was something she knew how to do. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. Outside, the Iron Fang Palace moved through its evening routines, guards changing posts, kitchen fires banked down, the last of the daytime meetings ending, and notes being carried from room to room. And somewhere on the other side of this building, In rooms she had not yet seen, Calum Drace was sitting at a long desk, covered in reports and border maps, and requests from 7 different quarters, doing the work of running a kingdom, and not thinking about her. Or so he told himself. The records room was exactly as overwhelming as Aldrich Vane was exactly as unwelcoming as Petra had promised. He was a small man in his 60s with ink permanently stained into the creases of his fingers and the manner of someone who had spent too many years surrounded by paper and not enough years surrounded by people. He looked at Serafina, when she arrived at precisely 5 minutes before the start of the working day, and said, "You are the girl the king has sent to help me." "I am Serafina Vale," she said. "I have experience with record-keeping and administrative organization. I am a fast reader and a careful writer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and gestured at a wall of shelving that extended from floor to ceiling, piled with documents in various states of organization, and said, "Those are the Eastern Border reports from the last 8 months. They are supposed to be organized by date and cross-referenced by location. As you can see, they are not." She looked at the shelving. She looked at Aldrich Vane. "I will need a clear system," she said. "Before I touch anything, I need to understand what the end goal looks like, not just what the current state is." He stared at her. Then, for the first time, something that might have been the distant ancestor of respect appeared in his expression. "Sit down," he said. "I will explain the system." She sat down, and the work began. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The kind of mind that found satisfaction in order, that could hold multiple categories simultaneously, and sort information into the right place without losing the thread. By mid-morning, she had worked through 2 months of border reports and developed a color-coding system that Aldrich Vane had initially objected to and then, after watching it work for 40 minutes, had gone quiet about, in the specific way that meant he had changed his mind and was not ready to say so out loud. The palace moved around her. She became a part of its rhythms. She learned who the kitchen staff were and what made them laugh. She learned that the medical ward was indeed understaffed, and began spending 2 evenings a week there, after her records work was finished, doing the same kind of practical triage she had done in Crestmere. Not medicine, but organization, the management of what was available. The healer in charge, a broad woman named Gretchen who had the bearing of someone who had seen too many things to be impressed by most of them, watched her for 3 days and then said, without particular ceremony, "You know what you are doing." "Enough to be useful," Serafina said. "Not enough to pretend otherwise." "Good," Gretchen said. "The ones who pretend otherwise are the dangerous ones." Life in the palace had a structure, and she fit herself into it, and the days began to accumulate. She did not see the Alpha King again in those first 2 weeks. She heard about him, the way you heard about weather, the way you heard about conditions you could not control but needed to understand. He was in meetings. He was reviewing something. He was in the training grounds at dawn every morning, which apparently he had done every morning since he was 16 years old, and no one had ever seen him miss a session. He had signed 3 border agreements and dissolved one that had been in place since his father's reign. He ate dinner alone, or with his senior counsel, and never seemed to find this unusual. She pieced together a picture of him from these fragments. A man of enormous discipline, who had built his own life around control, and kept it there. A man who did not waste words, and was therefore not comfortable around people who did. A man who had taken power at 18, and had made it mean something so thoroughly and deliberately, that by now, 7 years later, the power simply fit him, not like something he wore, but like something he was. She did not spend a great deal of time thinking about him. She had too much to do. But she noticed, in the small ways that attentive people notice things, that the morning after she had quietly rearranged the medical supply rooms and significantly reduced the time it took to find anything during an emergency, she arrived at the records room to find a new lamp on her desk. A good one, real oil, not the cheaper stuff that smoked and smelled. It had not been there the day before. Aldrich Vane, when she asked, said he had not ordered it. She did not ask anyone else. She went back to her work and did not think about it further, except in the way that a person who pays attention cannot fully stop paying attention, even when they decide to. Outside, in the corridors and rooms of the palace, the machinery of Iron Fang continued its work, and something that had no name yet, that had not been asked for by either party, moved in the air between a king who did not know how to want things he could not understand, and a woman who had survived everything she had not planned for, and kept walking anyway. Neither of them saw it. Not yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Serafina was in the records room, 3 weeks into her work at the palace, carefully cross-referencing supply invoices with delivery confirmations from the Southern District, when she heard the commotion in the corridor. She had learned, by then, to distinguish between the different kinds of noise this building produced. There was the steady hum of daily work, there was the sharp percussion of an emergency, and there was this, something in between, the kind of agitated movement that meant something had happened but not yet happened completely, that people were still moving toward a fact rather than inside it. She went on with her work. Aldrich Vane came in, 12 minutes later, moving faster than she had seen him move in 3 weeks, and closed the door behind him with the deliberate care of a man who did not want to be overheard. "The Ashfang clan has sent a communication," he said, still near the door. Serafina set down her pen. "What kind of communication?" "The formal kind, with a seal." He looked at her with his ink-stained fingers pressed together in front of him. "The Ashfang clan is the second most powerful pack in the eastern region. They and Ironfang have been in a state of formal tension for 11 years. Not war, not yet, but close enough that every communication is treated as a potential ignition point." She waited. "The letter accuses Ironfang of running supply disruptions along the Ashfang Eastern Corridor," he said. "Which we are not doing. But someone is, and the Ashfang leadership has decided it is us, and has presented what they describe as evidence to that effect." He paused. "The evidence includes intercepted supply manifests that appear to bear Ironfang authorization codes." Serafina looked at him steadily. "Appear to?" "Yes." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had lived long enough with paper to understand that documents could say anything and prove nothing. "The king has called a full council meeting for this evening. I have been asked to prepare a complete summary of all Ironfang supply operations along the eastern corridor for the past 6 months. He gestured at the shelving. "Which is precisely what you have been organizing." She understood immediately. "How much time do I have?" 5 hours. She was already standing, already moving to the shelving. "I will need you here," she said. "I can pull the documents faster than anyone else, because I organized them. But I need someone who can read the authorization codes and tell me immediately whether they match our actual records." He blinked. In 3 weeks, he had gradually shifted from tolerating her to quietly relying on her, but she had not before given him a direct instruction. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to his own desk and sat down and said, without ceremony, "Begin." They worked for 5 hours without stopping, except to drink from the water pitcher on the side table. By the time they were finished, Serafina had assembled a complete picture of every authorized supply movement along the eastern corridor in the past 6 months. Dates, quantities, authorization codes, delivery confirmations, all of it organized and cross-referenced and summarized in a document that Aldrich Vane looked at for a long moment before saying, quietly, "This is good work." "Is anything in here inconsistent with what the Ashfang letter describes?" she asked. "No," he said. "Nothing. The codes on the intercepted manifests. I need to see the actual letter. But based on what I know about our coding system, those are not formats we use. They are close, but they are not ours." "Forged," she said. "It appears so." She looked at the document she had assembled. "Then someone wants Ironfang and Ashfang to fight," she said. "Someone who understands supply chains and authorization codes well enough to forge them convincingly. But not someone who has actually worked inside this system, because if they had worked inside this system, they would have known that the codes would not match." Aldrich Vane looked at her for a long time. "You are perceptive," he said. "I pay attention," she said. "It is not the same thing, but it helps." He took the document to the council meeting. She did not go. She was staff, not council, and the meeting was not her place. She went back to her work and tried not to think about what it would mean if the situation with the Ashfang clan escalated. War between packs in the eastern region had a way of becoming everyone's problem, not just the problem of the packs involved. Crestmere had not been a pack village, it had been a mixed settlement, people with wolves and people without, living and working together in the practical way that people did when survival was a shared concern. But it had sat close enough to pack territory that its fate had always been partly determined by what those packs decided to do. She thought about the 63 people who had died in Crestmere. She thought about the rogue pack that had caused it, and the 3 months that the Iron Fang border forces had been tracking them. She thought about how easily things could compound, one act of violence leading to another, until the original cause was buried under so many consequences that no one could find it anymore. She went back to the supply invoices. 2 hours later, Petra appeared in the doorway. "The king wants to see you," she said. Serafina looked up. "Me specifically?" "Aldrich Vane told the council about the document you helped prepare," Petra said. "Yes, you specifically." She set down her pen, straightened her clothes, still the same plain things she had arrived in, though someone had quietly left a folded bundle of better quality cloth outside her door 3 days ago, and she had been wearing those since, and followed Petra through the palace. This time the meeting was not in the throne room. It was in a smaller room on the upper level, with a long table and maps on the walls, and the feeling of a place that was used for actual work rather than ceremony. 5 people sat around the table. She recognized Calum Drace immediately. She recognized the silver-haired man from the throne room, who Aldrich Vane had told her was called Lord Harwick, a senior council advisor. The other 3 she did not know. She stood at the end of the table. "Aldrich Vane tells me," Calum said, "that you identified the authorization code discrepancy before he did." "I identified it as a possibility," she said. "He confirmed it. He knows the system better than I do. I only recognized that the codes described in the letter did not match the patterns I had been working with for 3 weeks. "That is more than most people who work with those codes every day noticed," said a woman at the table, dark-haired, precise, with the careful posture of someone who expected to be listened to. "I am Alara Moss. I manage supply chain oversight for the western and southern regions." She looked at Serafina with something that was neither warm nor cold, but simply evaluating. "You have worked in records for 3 weeks. Yes. Before that, you worked in a village of 400 people. Yes. And you understood our authorization system well enough to spot a forgery." "I understood it well enough to spot an inconsistency," Serafina said. "Whether it is a forgery is a conclusion. I only have enough information to say that something does not match." Alara Moss looked at Calum. Something passed between them. Not the kind of silent communication that required closeness or familiarity, but the kind that came from having worked together long enough to have a shared shorthand. He nodded very slightly. "We need someone," Alara Moss said, turning back to Serafina, "to go through all incoming supply documentation, not just from the Eastern Corridor, but from all directions, and identify any other patterns that do not match our actual codes. The work you did today took 5 hours. We need a more systematic version of that process, to be running continuously, not as a response to a crisis, but as a standard check." She paused. "That requires someone who understands the codes thoroughly, reads quickly, and thinks about what they see, rather than simply processing it." Serafina looked at Calum Drace, because he was the one who had put her in the records room to begin with, and she wanted to understand whether this was his direction or Alara Moss's. He was watching her with the same attentive stillness he had shown every time she had been in his presence. "It would require access to more documents than I currently have," she said. "Yes," he said. "And a clearer understanding of the complete coding system, not just the Eastern Corridor version." "Yes. That seems like a significant level of trust to extend to someone who has been here 3 weeks and arrived in chains." There was a brief silence around the table. "It would be," he said, "if I had not had you thoroughly investigated." He held her gaze. "Your story has been confirmed in every detail. The village elder of Crestmere's closest neighboring settlement, a man who knew your family for 20 years, provided a character account. The 11 survivors we located have all confirmed your presence in the village in the months before the attack. Your cousin in Thornfield has confirmed your identity." He paused. "I do not extend trust carelessly, but I extend it when it is warranted." She absorbed this. She thought about the fact that an entire investigation had been conducted about her without her knowledge, which was either thorough and responsible, or something else, depending on how you looked at it. She decided that from a king's perspective, it was simply the right thing to do, and that she would have done the same. "All right," she said, "I can do this." "Good," he said, and that, apparently, was that. She was shown to a different room the following morning. Not larger exactly, but better equipped, with a wider table and better light, and access to a secondary filing system she had not known existed. Aldrich Vane, whose territory this technically encroached on, had been consulted beforehand and had agreed with the particular gruff acceptance of a man who was too overwhelmed to argue against getting help. He came by mid-morning to show her the complete coding system, all the variations, all the regional differences, and she sat with it for an hour afterward and mapped it in her own notes, because the way the official documentation presented it was not the way her mind worked. She built a system. It took 4 days to design and another 3 days to implement, and when it was running it was not perfect. Nothing was perfect, especially nothing that depended on humans being consistent, but it was better than what existed before, which was nothing. She did not see the Alpha King during those 7 days. She heard about him, as always, but he did not come to the records area or the new monitoring room, and she did not expect him to. He had delegated this. Delegation was a form of trust. On the 8th day, however, she found him in the corridor. She was coming back from the medical ward in the early evening, still holding a list of supply requests she had been helping Gretchen organize, and she turned a corner and nearly walked directly into him. He caught her arm, one hand, steadying, before she could stumble back, and let go immediately when she was stable. "I am sorry," she said, because it had been genuinely her fault. She had not been watching where she was going. "You were reading while walking," he said. It was not a question or a reprimand, just an observation. "I do it more than I should," she admitted. He looked at the list in her hand, medical supplies, written in Gretchen's large, decisive handwriting, with her own notes added in the margins. He did not try to read it, but he registered what it was. "You are still working in the medical ward in the evenings." "Gretchen is short-staffed," she said. "I am not doing medicine. I am doing what I do. Organizing, managing supplies, keeping records." "You were not asked to do that." "No," she agreed. "But it needed doing, and I could do it." He was quiet for a moment. They were standing in a corridor that was not wide, which meant that the absence of significant space between them was simply practical geometry. But she was aware of it, in the way she was aware of all things that were slightly outside her usual experience. "The Ashfang situation has de-escalated," he said. "The forged documents were traced to a broker who operates out of the Crestfell region. He is not affiliated with Ashfang. He appears to have been working independently, attempting to generate conflict that would benefit a third-party merchant group with interests in alternative supply routes." He paused. "The documentation your monitoring system flagged in the first 3 days confirmed 2 additional forged authorizations, both of which pointed back to the same source." She stared at him. 3 days? The system identified patterns on day 2. Confirmation took another day. "I did not hear about this. I am telling you now." He looked at her for a moment. The situation was serious. 11 years of tension between Iron Fang and the Ashfang clan, and someone was attempting to light it. Your work prevented that. She did not know how to receive this. She thought about saying that she had only done what she was in a position to do, which was true. She thought about saying it was not important, which was not true, and she did not say things that were not true. She thought about simply nodding, which was what she did. He nodded back. Then he moved a step past her. "Alpha King," she said. He paused. "The new staff in the medical wing," she said. "I know you are waiting for the ones from the capital, but there are 2 people in the eastern staff quarters who have basic medical training. They came with the last border patrol rotation, and they are currently assigned to cleaning duties. Gretchen does not know they exist because the staff assignment sheets are not shared between departments. If you reassign them to the medical wing, the wait for the capital staff becomes significantly less urgent." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about staff in the eastern quarters?" he asked. "I eat in the same dining hall as everyone," she said. "I listen." Something moved across his face, very briefly. Then he said, simply, "I will look into it," and walked on. She watched him go. She was not sure what he was, exactly. This man who had built a kingdom around himself so thoroughly that the kingdom and the man were nearly indistinguishable. She did not think she could figure it out quickly. She was not sure that was the point. She went back to reading while walking, and turned the corner, and went to her room for the evening. The 2 staff members from the eastern quarters were reassigned to the medical wing the following morning. She noticed. She did not say anything about it to anyone, but she noticed. It was Lord Harwick who introduced the poison. Not literal poison. He was subtler than that, And besides, poison required proximity, and Harwick had learned long ago that the most effective way to destroy something was from a safe distance, using words instead of substances. Words were cleaner. Words could be shaped and redirected, and if they failed, you had never formally said them. The morning was a week after the Ashfang crisis had been quietly resolved, and Harwick stood in the council room with 4 other senior advisors and spoke in the measured, considered tone of a man who believed he was simply raising valid concerns. "The girl has been here 5 weeks, he said. She arrived with no identification, no pack affiliation, and no verifiable connection to any established community. Her story checks out, yes, I am aware. But a story checking out is not the same as trust being earned. She now has access to our complete authorization coding system, our supply chain documentation, and our medical supply inventory. That is a significant amount of sensitive information for someone who has been here less than 2 months. Her work on the Ashfang situation," someone started. "Could have been an attempt to demonstrate value and establish trust," Harwick said, smoothly, without raising his voice. "I am not saying it was. I am saying we do not know. We know she is intelligent. We know she is capable. We know she came from a destroyed village that a rogue pack attacked." He paused. "We do not know, definitively, which pack that rogue group was aligned with." The room was quiet. "The Iron Fang tracking reports say the rogue pack had eastern origins," Harwick continued. "Ashfang territory has an eastern border. The Ashfang clan has, in the past, used independent rogue groups as a form of plausible deniability for aggressive actions. This was true. Serafina would not have disputed it if she had been in the room, because it was, in fact, documented history. "I am not making an accusation," Harwick said. "I am raising a question. Is it possible, not certain, not even likely, but possible, that this woman's arrival here was not coincidental, that her intelligence and her helpfulness and her remarkable series of useful contributions are not spontaneous, that someone sent her here knowing exactly what would happen?" He let the question sit. The advisors looked at each other. They were not bad people, most of them. They were simply people who had spent their careers thinking about worst-case scenarios, because the alternative was being unprepared when worst cases arrived. Harwick's scenario was not impossible. It was not even entirely implausible. It was, at minimum, a scenario that needed to be considered. "What do you suggest?" asked Alara Moss. She had said the least, and her voice was careful. "I suggest," Harwick said, "that we remain cautious. That we do not expand her access further, and that we keep a close watch on her communications and movements." He paused. "I am not suggesting she be removed. She is useful, and removing her on suspicion alone would be unjust if the suspicion is unfounded. But useful and trustworthy are not the same thing." The meeting ended. Harwick gathered his papers and walked out into the corridor and felt, with the satisfaction of a man who had planted something and was content to wait for it to grow, that he had done what was necessary. He had reasons for what he did. They were not the reasons he had stated in that room, but they were reasons, and he had lived with them long enough that they felt, to him, like simply protecting what needed to be protected. The truth was that Lord Harwick had a nephew. The nephew was 26, ambitious, and had been courting a position in the palace record system for 8 months. He had the education and the family connection, and the social standing, that should have been sufficient. He had not been given the position because, as the records master had determined, he was not particularly good at the work. And now a girl from a destroyed village had come and occupied that role, and occupied it extraordinarily well, and made the nephew's chances even more remote. That was one thing. The other thing was more complicated, and Harwick did not look at it directly, because the parts of himself he did not look at directly were the parts he was most certain about. Harwick had, in the early years of Calum Drace's reign, made himself indispensable. He had been the one experienced voice in a council of uncertain men, the one who knew how things worked and could explain them to a young king who was learning fast but was still learning. That relationship, advisor and uncertain young king, had been productive and comfortable for Harwick, and he had been good at it. The young king was no longer uncertain. He had not been uncertain for several years. He had grown into his power so completely that the role of experienced guide was no longer needed, and Harwick's relevance had shifted from essential to simply present. He had handled this by knowing things and being the person who knew things, and carefully managing the flow of information so that it came through him. He did not think of this as manipulation. He thought of it as managing the system. It was, he would have argued, the same thing. Seraphina Vale, with her quiet competence and her direct speech and her apparent inability to be impressed by anything, had in 5 weeks managed to make herself useful in ways that bypassed him entirely. She did not come to him for information. She went to source. She did not ask him to interpret things. She interpreted them herself. She had gone directly to the king in a corridor conversation and suggested a staff reassignment that Harwick had known about for a week and had been considering whether to mention. She did not know he existed as anything other than a face in the council room. That, more than anything, was the problem. So he had raised concerns. Legitimate, reasonable, carefully constructed concerns that could not be disproven because they were framed as questions rather than claims. He had done it in a room full of people who would remember that he had been the one to notice. And he had gone home to his rooms that evening feeling, as he usually did after such moments, that he had been both necessary and prudent. He was wrong about both, but he would not know that for some time. Seraphina noticed the shift on a Thursday morning. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, not in a large obvious way, but in small accumulated adjustments that did not quite add up to the previous pattern. The new document requests she had submitted for access were not processed. A message she sent to Alara Moss asking about a supply discrepancy she had identified went unanswered for 3 days, which was unusual. When she arrived at the council level to deliver the weekly documentation summary, something she had been doing for 2 weeks without comment, she was met by a guard at the stairs and politely told that the summary should be left at the ground floor desk. She left it at the ground floor desk. She went back to her room that evening and sat at her table and thought about it carefully. Something had changed. The change was not dramatic and was not hostile. She had not been accused of anything, had not been spoken to harshly, had not been restricted in any obvious way. She could still do her work. She still had her room. She still ate in the dining hall. But something in the atmosphere of her interaction with the upper levels had contracted, and she wanted to understand why. She thought about who had the ability and the motivation to shift that atmosphere. She thought about the meeting rooms she had seen, the faces around the table, the dynamic of the council. She thought about the silver-haired man who had been present from the beginning and had not once addressed her directly. Lord Harwick. She could not prove it. She had no specific information, but she understood patterns, and the pattern of this felt like a person who had decided she was something to be managed, rather than simply something to be assessed. The difference was subtle but distinct. Being assessed left room for the assessment to end. Being managed was a permanent state. She did not panic. Panic was what happened when you believed the situation was outside your ability to influence. She did not believe that yet. She wrote a careful, thorough report of the supply discrepancy she had identified, including all supporting documentation and a clear chain of evidence. She sent it to Aldrich Vane, not to the council level, because Aldrich Vane was a man who cared about the work more than about the politics around the work. She included a note at the bottom. This pattern suggests systematic misdirection at the point of entry, worth flagging to whoever reviews these matters. Then she went to the medical wing and spent 3 hours helping Gretchen reorganize the pharmaceutical cabinet, which had been in a state of productive chaos since the 2 reassigned staff members had begun rotating through duties, and came back to her room, smelling like dried herbs and feeling the specific tiredness that came from physical, useful work. She did not know, lying in her bed that night, that the report she had sent to Aldrich Vane would land on Calum Drace's desk 4 days later, with Aldrich Vane's notation at the top. This was flagged to me, rather than the council. I believe this was intentional. The discrepancy identified is significant. She did not know that Calum would read it, and then read it again, and then sit back in his chair and look at the wall for a long time. She did not know that his wolf, that deep, ancient, wordless thing that lived in his chest and mostly did what it was told, had been, for some weeks now, entirely failing to do what it was told in a very specific and growing way whenever her name came up in conversation, or her handwriting appeared on a document on his desk. He had not told anyone about that. It was the kind of thing you did not tell anyone, because it was the kind of thing that, if it meant what it historically meant in his world, had enormous consequences that he was absolutely not ready to think about. He set the report down and went to bed and told himself, very firmly, that whatever was happening inside him was simply a result of finding someone unexpectedly competent in a context where competence was always needed. He believed this right up until the moment he did not. The wolf pup came through the gap in the cell door on a Wednesday. Serafina had been sitting on the floor, not from despair but from the simple preference for a different angle, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and a small problem in her head she had been working through. She had been working through it for 2 days. She had not told anyone about it because she was not certain of it yet, and she had learned early in life that raising an alarm before you were certain was worse than staying quiet until you were, because false alarms did not just fail to solve things, they made people less likely to listen when you raised the right alarm later. The problem was this: the supply discrepancies she had identified did not originate in the supply system. She had checked and cross-checked and checked again. They appeared in the supply system, yes, but the origin point, the actual source, was in the authorization process itself. Someone with access to the authorization system was either approving transactions that should not exist, or approving real transactions, and then redirecting the documentation, so the goods went somewhere else entirely. She had been systematically working through a list of everyone with that level of access. The list was short. 8 people. 7 of them were accounted for by every piece of evidence she had. Their access patterns matched their documented decisions. There were no unexplained gaps, no timing irregularities, no small inconsistencies of the kind that appeared when a person was doing 2 things where the record only showed 1. The 8th name she had been circling for 2 days. She was not certain. She was close to certain, but close was not the same. This was what she had been thinking about when the gap in the cell door produced a small, limping wolf pup. He was perhaps 8 weeks old, gray and white, with the disproportionate paws and the slightly too large ears that young wolves had before they grew into their bodies. He was limping because his left front leg was held at an angle that was not quite right. Not broken, she thought, but badly sprained, or perhaps suffering a soft tissue injury. He came through the gap and stopped just inside the door and looked at her with the considering expression that young wolves had, which was very different from the fearful expression that most small animals had when encountering an unfamiliar human. He was not afraid of her. He was assessing her. "Hello," she said. He took 3 more steps toward her, favoring the injured leg. She did not move toward him. She had been around animals her whole life, and she understood that the worst thing you could do with a frightened or injured creature was move toward them before they had decided to move toward you. She simply sat where she was and kept her hands still and her voice low. "You have hurt your leg," she said. "Come here, and I will look at it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he came and sat down directly in front of her, which was either the most trusting thing she had ever seen, or a sign that this particular pup had spent enough time around humans to have lost his natural caution entirely. She reached out one hand, slowly, and let him sniff it. He sniffed for a long moment. Then he made a small sound and moved his head under her hand, which she understood as permission. She ran her fingers carefully down the injured leg. He made no sound beyond a brief tightening of his whole small body when she reached the point of injury, which she now suspected was a soft tissue strain in the shoulder joint rather than anything in the leg itself. The way he was holding it, slightly pulled back and held close to his body, suggested the problem was higher up than she had initially thought. "There," she said, "shoulder, not leg. That is better news, actually." He seemed unconvinced of this, but did not move away. She had torn off a strip of cloth from the hem of her shirt 2 days ago. She tended to do this when she needed to think, a habit from childhood, something about the repetitive physical work of the strip keeping her hands busy while her mind worked, and she used it now to make a simple support wrap for the shoulder joint. She did not know if pups accepted wrapping in the way adult wolves did. Each animal was different, and young ones were unpredictable. But this one sat still through the whole process, with the patience of something that had decided, for reasons of its own, to trust her. When she was done, he looked at his wrapped shoulder. Then he looked at her. Then he lay down beside her, his chin on her knee. She sat there with her hand resting lightly on his back, feeling his breathing, and went back to thinking about the authorization system and the 8th name on the list, and the problem arranged itself differently from this angle. Lower to the ground, quieter. in the company of something that had simply decided she was safe. She did not hear, because she had no way to hear it, the soft sound of boots in the corridor outside. She did not know that someone had stopped just outside the cell door. She did not know how long the person stood there, only that the pup did not raise his head, which meant he knew the person outside and was not alarmed by them. She worked through the problem. The 8th name on the list was Lord Harwick. She had not wanted it to be him. Not because she had any particular feeling about Harwick. She had observed him from a distance and found him opaque, which was a kind of information in itself. But because the implications of it being him were significantly more complicated than if it had been a junior administrator. Harwick was senior counsel. Harwick had been in this palace longer than Calum Drace himself. Harwick had access to things that gave his name appearing on a suspicious list a weight that was different from anyone else on that list. She was not certain yet. She was close. She needed 2 more data points, and then she would be certain. And when she was certain, she would have to decide who to tell and how. This was not something she was going to solve tonight. She let herself know that, let herself put it down for the evening, because she had learned that problems you carried into sleep were problems that got heavier overnight, and she needed to be sharp tomorrow. The pup had fallen asleep with his chin still on her knee. His breathing was even and slow, with the particular warmth that sleeping animals produced, which was one of the more reliable comforts in the world. She put her back against the wall and closed her eyes and let herself be, just for a little while, simply the person in the room with a sleeping wolf on her knee, and a problem that was nearly but not quite solved, and a life that was entirely different from the one she had expected to be living. Outside the cell door, in the corridor, the sound of boots moved away, very quietly, as though the person leaving did not want to announce that they had been there. She felt this rather than heard it. She did not open her eyes. She thought, he was there. She thought, he stood there for a long time. She thought, he did not come in. She let the thoughts settle. She did not yet know what they meant. She was not the kind of person who attached meaning to things before she had evidence for the meaning. But she was also not the kind of person who dismissed data simply because she could not yet explain it. She filed it alongside the 8th name on the list, and the shoulder-injured wolf pup, and the lamp that had appeared on her desk 3 weeks ago, and she let all of it sit in the part of her mind that was good at waiting. The wolf pup made a small sound in his sleep. "I know," she said softly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to all of it. "I know." Morning came earlier than she expected, which meant she had slept more deeply than she usually did in uncertain situations. She lay still for a moment, aware of the pup's warm weight beside her. He had moved at some point in the night from her knee to pressed against her side, and then sat up carefully so as not to disturb him. She needed to get those 2 additional data points today. She needed to do it without revealing what she was looking for, because if Harwick was what she suspected him to be, the moment he realized someone was tracing him, evidence would disappear. He was intelligent. She had observed that from a distance as well. He was careful. He had been doing whatever he was doing for long enough that it had not been caught, which meant he had built systems around it. She needed to be more careful than he was. This was not a comfortable position, being more careful than a man who had spent decades learning to be careful. But she had something he did not have, which was that he did not yet know she existed as a threat. From his perspective, she was either already neutralized, whatever he had done to contract the atmosphere around her access, or simply irrelevant. Either was useful. The pup opened his eyes and looked at her. "Good morning," she said. He stretched. He tried the wrapped shoulder, gingerly. He looked at the wrapping with the expression of an animal that was not sure how it felt about this arrangement, but was willing to consider it for now. Then he looked at the door. "You can go if you want," she said. "Come back if you like." He went to the gap in the door. He paused there for a moment, looking back at her. Then he went through it and was gone. Serafina stood up, rolled her shoulders, and thought about how to find the 2 pieces of information she needed without anyone knowing she was looking for them. She had a plan by the time she had washed her face. She went to the dining hall and ate breakfast and listened to the conversations around her with the same open, unhurried attention she always brought to it. She was looking for one specific thing, someone who worked in the document receiving office on the administrative floor, and who ate at this time. She had seen the face before, a man named Gerald, 30s, who had the permanent ink stain on his right forefinger that came from working with documents every day and not taking the time to wash it off properly. She had spoken to him twice about record delivery schedules. He was at a table near the east window. She picked up her tray and sat 2 chairs away from him and said, "Gerald, good morning. Can I ask you something about delivery records?" He looked up from his meal, blinked, then nodded with the expression of a man who did not mind the interruption. She asked him about something entirely different from what she needed. She asked about the intake process for incoming supply documentation, how it was logged, when it was logged, who saw it first. He explained in the patient way of a man who liked his work and liked explaining it, and she listened, and asked the occasional question, and worked the conversation toward the specific thing she needed, with the gradual, unhurried precision of a person who had planned this in advance and was allowing it to look spontaneous. By the end of breakfast, she had the first data point. The second she found by a different method, in the afternoon, during a brief visit to the archives room to return a set of documents she had borrowed the previous week. She took a slightly longer route back. She had legitimate access to the corridor she needed to walk down. She was carrying papers, which was entirely normal. She looked at what she needed to look at for 45 seconds, and then she walked on, and she went back to her room and sat at her table. She had the 2 data points. She sat with them for a long time, turning them carefully, looking at them from every angle, testing them against everything else she had accumulated. Then she sat back. It was Harwick. The moving of funds through falsified supply authorizations, small enough individually to pass cursory review, were going somewhere. She now knew where. It was an account she recognized from the financial records she had processed 3 weeks ago, listed under a name she had not thought about at the time, because there had been no reason to. She had not been looking for it then. She was looking at everything now. The account belonged to a holding company in the Thornfield region that, through 2 intermediate layers, came back to a property registered in the name of a man who shared both a surname and a family resemblance with Lord Harwick's documented genealogy. A nephew. She would need to verify that specifically, but the shape of it was clear. She thought about what to do with this. Going to the council was not the right move. Harwick was on the council. Going to Alara Moss felt safer, but she was not certain of Alara's independence from Harwick's influence. Going to Aldrich Vane was better. Aldrich was a man who cared about paper and records and would care about this, but he was not the right person to act on it, only to confirm it. There was one right person to take this to. She thought about the corridor, the boots moving away in the night. She thought about the lamp on her desk. She thought about the 2 staff members reassigned to the medical wing. She thought about a king who listened and who extended trust when it was warranted, who had told her that, and meant it. She wrote everything down, carefully, with full documentation and clear notation of her evidence chain, the same way she wrote everything. She organized it so that the conclusion came last and the evidence came first, because evidence first was how you showed a person you were not asking them to believe you. You were asking them to look at the same things you had looked at and reach their own conclusion. Then she asked to see the Alpha King. She did not get to see the Alpha King. The message came back through Petra, not unkindly, but with the flat efficiency of someone delivering a decision rather than an opinion, that the Alpha King was unavailable for non-council matters until the following week, and that any information of concern should be submitted through the standard council channels. Serafina looked at the message for a moment. Then she thought about Harwick, who sat on the council, who had access to everything that came through standard channels, who had spent the better part of a month quietly managing her out of influence, while maintaining the appearance of simply raising reasonable concerns. She folded the message and set it aside. She thought about sending the report to Aldrich Vane as she had before, but this was different from the Ashfang situation. The Ashfang documentation had been a discrepancy in external correspondence, manageable, neutral territory for a records master. This was internal financial fraud, involving a senior council member. This was not something Aldrich Vane could absorb into his filing system and route upward without significant risk. She thought about Alara Moss. She did not know Alara well enough to know where her loyalties sat in relation to Harwick. The woman was precise and capable, but precision and capability did not tell you where a person stood when the standing became difficult. She thought about Gretchen, who cared about none of the political architecture of this place, and who had said, 3 weeks ago, that the ones who pretended to know more than they did were the dangerous ones. Gretchen could not act on this, but she might know who could. She went to the medical wing that evening. "I need to ask you something," she said, when the ward was quiet, and Gretchen was making notes in the treatment log. "Not about medicine." Gretchen looked up. She had the particular attention of a person who had learned that when someone with sense said they needed to ask something not about the thing you usually discussed, the thing they needed to ask was usually important. "Is there someone in this palace," Serafina asked carefully, "who is both honest and powerful enough to act on something? Someone who is not part of the senior council?" Gretchen looked at her for a long moment. "How significant is the something?" "Significant enough that I do not want it to disappear into channels that might have an interest in its disappearing." Gretchen set down her pen. She folded her hands. "The general," she said. "Owen Croft. He commands the palace guard and reports directly to the king, not to the council. He does not like politics and does not participate in them. He is not subtle and he is not patient, but he is honest. Everyone knows it. Where would I find him? Training grounds, 6 in the morning. He is there every day, the same as the king." Serafina nodded. "Thank you." "Whatever you have found," Gretchen said, looking at her steadily, "be certain before you take it to Owen Croft. He does not deal in half information. If you are going to him, go with everything." "I am certain," Serafina said. At 6 the next morning, she was at the training grounds. General Owen Croft was exactly what Gretchen had described. A broad man in his 40s, with short-cropped hair starting to go gray, and the manner of someone who had long ago decided that directness was more efficient than any alternative. He was in the middle of a training exercise when she arrived, speaking to a group of guards in the clipped, specific way of a man who gave instructions that were meant to be followed precisely. She waited at the edge of the grounds. He noticed her after about 10 minutes. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, without ceremony, assessing. "You are the records girl," he said, when he came to the edge of the grounds. "Serafina Vale," she said. "I have something to show you. I cannot take it through normal channels because the problem involves the normal channels." He looked at her for a moment. "Walk with me," he said, and turned toward the perimeter of the grounds, moving at a pace that required effort to keep up with. She walked with him, and she told him what she had found. Not the emotional version of it, not the version with emphasis and urgency, and the implicit ask to feel what she felt about it. She told him the factual version, clean and ordered and sourced, the same way she had written it in her report. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. "You have documentation," he said. "Yes, complete chain of evidence." "How long?" "The pattern goes back at least 11 months, based on what I could access. Possibly longer." He was quiet again. They had completed a full circuit of the training grounds. He stopped at the far edge and turned to face her. "Why not the council?" he said. "Harwick is council. Why not the supply oversight?" "Elara Moss and Harwick have worked together for 9 years. I do not know where she stands." "Why not the records master?" "Aldrich Vane is not in a position to act on this. He is in a position to confirm it. That is different." Owen Croft looked at her steadily. There was something in his expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who had not expected the specificity and clarity he was getting from the source he was getting it from. Then it resolved into something simpler. Decision. "Give me the report," he said. She gave it to him. He took it without opening it and held it at his side and said, "Do not talk about this to anyone. Do not appear to be doing anything out of the ordinary. Continue your work." "I understand," she said. "And do not trust the feeling that this is resolved," he said. "It is not resolved. It is beginning. There is a difference." She looked at him. "How long?" "Long enough to be sure," he said. "Do not expect fast." Fast was 3 days. It did not feel like fast. It felt like 3 days, in which everything looked the same on the surface, and she felt the particular strain of knowing something large was underneath it. She went to records. She went to the medical wing. She ate in the dining hall and listened and watched, and did not change any of the ways she had always been, because changing them would have been a signal. On the 3rd day, there was a meeting she was not invited to, and did not hear about until afterward. On the 4th day, Lord Harwick did not appear in any of the places he usually appeared. On the 5th day, Petra came to the records room in the mid-morning with a message, and the message was simple. "The Alpha King will see you this afternoon." She went. The room he met her in was the same working room she had been taken to before. Maps on the walls, long table, the feeling of a place used for real decisions. He was standing when she entered, not at the table but at the far wall, looking at one of the maps, and he turned when she came in. He looked different from the last time she had seen him in a formal context, not less composed. She was not sure he was capable of less composed, but carrying something. A weight in the set of his shoulders that was not quite tiredness and not quite anger, and was probably both in some proportion she could not name. Owen Croft was there too, standing to the side. "Sit down," Calum said, not rudely, simply. She sat. He turned from the wall and looked at her, and she had the full force of those silver eyes again, which were not warm exactly, but were intensely present in the way that very few people's eyes were. "You found this 8 days ago," he said. "You attempted to come to me through normal channels. When that was unavailable, you considered your options and went to someone you had assessed as both trustworthy and independent of the problem." He paused. "You did not attempt to handle it yourself. You did not sit on it. You moved it as quickly as you safely could without exposing it." "Yes," she said. "Why not wait?" "Because information sitting still is information losing value." Every day the pattern continued, was a day more of loss to Iron Fang's resources, and a day more of evidence that could be moved, or destroyed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned slightly toward Owen Croft. "Tell her." Owen Croft stepped forward. "Based on the report and subsequent investigation, funds have been diverted from the Iron Fang supply system in amounts totaling approximately 40,000 in standard currency over an 11-month period. The funds moved through 3 shell accounts and were consolidated in a property holding associated with Lord Harwick's nephew." He paused. "Harwick confessed this morning. He has been placed under house restriction, pending a formal hearing." Serafina sat with that for a moment. 40,000. 11 months. She had known it was significant. She had not quantified it fully. "The Ashfang situation," she said. "Was that connected?" "We believe so," Calum said. "The broker who forged the supply authorizations appears to have been hired by Harwick to generate a crisis that would redirect investigation away from the internal accounts. The Ashfang clan has been informed, and the connection has been acknowledged." He paused. "They were not involved. They were also being manipulated." "Harwick was willing to start a war," she said. "Not as an accusation, just as a fact that needed stating." "Yes," Calum said. The room was quiet for a moment. "The documents you submitted to me through Aldrich Vane 8 days ago," he said, "flagged the authorization anomaly. That was the start of Owen Croft's parallel investigation, which corroborated everything in your report." He looked at her. "You have been in this palace for 6 weeks. "Yes," she said. "And in 6 weeks you found something that has been occurring for 11 months undetected." "I had advantages that others did not," she said. "I came in from outside without any assumptions about what I was looking at. I was processing documents without knowing what they were supposed to look like before I knew what they actually looked like. Anomalies are easier to see when you have not been looking at the same system for years." He was quiet, looking at her. "What do you want?" he asked. She blinked. It was an unexpected question. "I am sorry?" "You could have sat on this," he said. "Used it as leverage. Waited for the right moment and offered it in exchange for something. More access, better position, protection. That is what people with information usually do. That is what people do when they are uncertain of their standing and trying to improve it," she said. "I am uncertain of my standing, yes. But that method of improving it would require me to care more about my standing than about the fact that 40,000 in funds were leaving a kingdom through a fraudulent system, and those are not the right priorities in the right order." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened. Something that she had not seen from him before and could not have anticipated. Something shifted in the careful architecture of his expression. Not broke, not crumbled, but shifted, like a very controlled building in a small wind, revealing that beneath the architecture there was a person who felt things, who had always felt things, who had simply built a great deal of structure around the feeling. "You may return to your work," he said. "Your access level is being expanded. The restrictions that were quietly placed on your account in recent weeks have been removed." He paused. "And I want you to know that what you did here was not small." She stood. "It was only what needed doing," she said. "Yes," he said. "Most people know what needs doing. The difference is in whether they do it. She left. In the corridor outside, she let herself stand still for just a moment, one hand against the cool stone wall, and breathed. She was all right. She was more than all right. She went back to the records room and sat down at her desk and looked at the good oil lamp and thought about 6 weeks in a place that had not been hers, in a life that had not been planned, and the specific way that doing the right thing in difficult conditions produced a feeling that was not happiness exactly, but was its more reliable cousin. Behind her, in the room she had left, 2 men stood in a working silence. "She is remarkable," Owen Croft said. Calum Drace said nothing. He turned back to the map on the wall. He put one hand flat against the surface of it, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something he had not yet named. His wolf did not say anything either, but it was paying attention with the focused, certain attention of something that had been patient for a long time and was becoming less patient. She had been in the palace for 8 weeks when the poisoning attempt happened. She did not know it was a poisoning attempt at the time. That was the thing about attempts that were carefully made. They were designed to look like something else. She came back to her room after the late session in the medical wing feeling unusually tired, which she attributed to 4 consecutive long days and not enough sleep, and she drank the cup of water that sat on her table and went to bed. She woke in the early morning hours, feeling wrong, in a way that was very specific and very deliberate. Not sick the way illness felt. She had been sick before, and she understood what that felt like. This was something else, a heaviness in her limbs, and a blurred quality to her thinking, and a slight difficulty with her breathing, that was not extreme, but was not right. She lay still and catalogued what she was feeling, with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and came to the conclusion, over about 20 minutes, that she had been given something in the water, most likely, or possibly in the small piece of fruit she had eaten before bed, something that was designed to look like ordinary illness, something calibrated to be uncomfortable without being immediately fatal, which meant whoever had done this was not trying to kill her outright. They were trying to frighten her, or disable her, or establish that she was vulnerable. She got out of bed. This was harder than usual. She moved to her table and sat down, and drank a large amount of plain water from a second container she kept there. Not from the cup, from a sealed container. She filled herself each day from the ground-level water supply room, and then she put her head down on her arms and waited for the body to do what it could on its own. She did not go to Gretchen, not because she was too unwell to move. She had judged that she could move if she needed to, but because she was thinking. She was thinking about who knew her schedule well enough to know that she would be in her room at that hour. She was thinking about who had access to the staff quarters. She was thinking about the fact that Harwick was under house restriction and not in a position to do this directly, but that a man who had operated through intermediaries for 11 months was a man who had intermediaries. She thought about the message he had sent, because this was a message. Not just an attempt, but a communication. You are not as safe as you think you are. By morning, the worst of it had passed. Her thinking cleared. The heaviness receded, though it left a tiredness behind that was different from her usual tiredness. She sat at her table and wrote down everything she had observed and thought, and concluded, dated it, and put it in the documentation she had been building since the Harwick investigation began. Then she washed her face and went to work. Aldrich Vane looked at her when she arrived and said, without preamble, "You look terrible." "I am fine," she said. "You look terrible," he said again, and went to a cabinet and produced a small bottle of something, and poured a measure of it into a cup, and handed it to her, without explanation. She looked at it. "Willow and ginger," he said. "It helps with the specific kind of feeling that looks like an illness but is not one." He said it without looking at her, already turning back to his own desk. She looked at the back of his head. She thought about what he had just said and what it implied. "Aldrich," she said. "Drink it," he said. She drank it. It was bitter and strong, and within 20 minutes she felt clearer. She went back to her work. At mid-morning, without ceremony and without announcement, Calum Drace walked into the records room. This was unusual. He did not come to the records room. He had not been here since the first week when he had arrived to check on her situation. Aldrich Vane stood up immediately in the way that people stood up when the Alpha King entered a room, and Seraphina stood up too because it was the appropriate thing to do, and Calum looked at her for 1 second, and then at Aldrich Vane. "Leave us," he said. Aldrich left with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to need things explained twice. The door closed. Calum turned to Serafina and looked at her with the focused, assessing gaze she had come to recognize as his particular form of attention. "You should have come to someone last night," he said. She blinked. "How do you know about last night?" "Because I was told this morning that someone in the staff quarters corridor was seen moving toward the eastern wing at approximately the time you would have been returning to your room," he said. "And because my security team has been running an enhanced watch on the staff wing since Harwick's house restriction was put in place, because Harwick is not the only person who needs to be considered in this situation." He paused. "And because Owen Croft talked to Aldrich Vane this morning." She absorbed this, the willow and ginger. Aldrich had known. He had been watching for it too, in his quiet, paper-focused way. "I was not in danger," she said. "I assessed the situation and determined I was not." "You are not a healer," he said. "I am a person who has worked alongside healers for years and who understood the nature of what she was experiencing. It was an intimidation measure, not an elimination attempt. If I had been at real risk, I would have gone to Gretchen." He was standing close. The room was not large, and he had moved to the center of it, and she had not moved, so the distance between them was smaller than it had been in their previous conversations. She was aware of it. She thought he was aware of it too, though his expression did not show it. "You cannot keep managing these things on your own," he said. "I am not on my own," she said. "I have Aldrich Vane, who appears to have been keeping a quiet eye on me. I have Gretchen. I have General Croft's security arrangements." She paused. "I trust the people I have given reason to trust me." Something in him shifted slightly. She saw it. "And do you trust me?" he asked. She thought about this honestly, because she answered every question honestly, even ones that were complicated. "I trust your intentions," she said. "You are a man who does what he says he will do. You said you would investigate my story, and you did. You said you would remove the restrictions when the situation was resolved, and you did. Your actions have been consistent with your words every time, which is a higher standard than most people meet." "That is not quite an answer to the question," he said. "I know," she said. "I am still working toward the answer." He was quiet for a moment. "You will not be in this situation again," he said. "The man who was seen in the corridor last night is being questioned. He is one of Harwick's staff. This will be addressed." "I know," she said. "I am not afraid." "I am aware that you are not afraid," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite exasperation, and not quite admiration, but occupied the space between them. That is not always a reassuring quality. She looked at him. For the first time in this particular conversation, she felt something that was not merely the management of a situation, something warmer, less calculated, the specific kind of thing that happened when you were with a person who saw you clearly, and you were aware of it. "I will let someone know the next time," she said. "Yes," he said. "You will." He left. She sat back down. She picked up her pen and looked at the document in front of her, and did not read it for about 60 seconds. Then she went back to work. The wolf pup came back that afternoon, through the same gap in the door, which, she now understood, was not a failure of the building's maintenance, but a gap that had been there long enough that the pup knew it. He had been in this part of the palace before. He came and sat beside her desk, and she reached down and ran her fingers along his back, checking the shoulder joint automatically. "Better, significantly better." "You are healing well," she said. He looked up at her with his pale eyes. "You should probably have a name," she said. He made a small sound. "I will think about it," she said, and went back to work. She thought about it for 3 days before she settled on one. She did not tell anyone what the name was, because she was not sure how people here felt about someone naming a wolf that did not belong to her, and she had learned that in uncertain situations, the wise approach was to do the quiet version of the thing until you understood whether the loud version was appropriate. She called him Ash, after the color he would probably be when he was fully grown, and also, in the private part of her where she was honest about everything, after the village she had come from and could not go back to. It was a name that meant more than one thing, which was a quality she found appropriate for something she expected to keep in her life. 3 weeks later, on a morning that was the beginning of the coldest month in Iron Fang's annual cycle, The pup stopped being a pup. Not all at once. It happened in the way that significant things happened, which was gradually and then suddenly, and one morning she reached down to scratch his ears and realized she was reaching lower than she used to, and that the creature under her hand was no longer small. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her, unimpressed by his own development, as wolves often were. "All right," she said. "All right." She did not yet know that wolves in Iron Fang did not attach to people randomly. She did not yet know that the wolf who chose you was choosing you in a way that meant something in the deep, old vocabulary of this world. She had no wolf of her own, had never had one, had grown up without one in a village where that was unusual but not impossible, in the way that some people grew up without a specific kind of sight or hearing, and simply learned to navigate differently. She did not know what it meant that a wolf pup had come through a gap in a cell door and put his chin on her knee and let her wrap his shoulder and then kept coming back, day after day, growing steadily into the shape of something large and silver and unmistakably purposeful. But somewhere in this palace, in a part of himself that he had not yet allowed to become a fact he dealt with, Calum Drace knew. His wolf had been telling him for weeks. He had not been listening. Or rather, he had been listening and choosing not to respond, because responding meant acknowledging that something was happening over which he had no control, and that was the one condition he had built his entire adult life around avoiding. He stood at his window in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, and looked out at the territory that was his by every possible measure, by blood, by work, by the years he had spent making it so, and he felt the thing in his chest that was his wolf, making the same argument it had been making for weeks, with increasing insistence. He put his hand against the cold glass, and said nothing, and felt the argument, and did not give it a name. Outside, in the gray morning, the Iron Fang territory stretched to every horizon. Inside, in a room he had never visited but could have found with his eyes closed, Seraphina Vale was already awake, already sitting at her small table, already working, with a large silver wolf pressed against her ankle, and a lamp burning in the early dark. He knew where she was at every moment. He had been trying not to know that. The letter from Ashfang arrived on the morning that changed everything. It was not hostile this time. It was an invitation, formal, sealed, written in the careful diplomatic language of a clan that was re-establishing contact after a period of damage and wanted to be clear about its intentions. The Ashfang Alpha, a man named Garrett Cole who had ruled the clan for 22 years and was known as a practical and unsentimental leader, was proposing a meeting. A formal discussion of the circumstances that had led to the previous crisis, and a potential path toward normalizing relations between the two packs, for the first time in 11 years. This was significant. The senior council received it as significant, even without Harwick, who was now formally under investigation and confined to his quarters. The remaining members understood what the letter represented. A meeting of this kind, if successful, would fundamentally shift the power balance in the eastern region. Calum called a full council meeting that ran through the morning and into the afternoon, and the question that occupied most of it was not whether to accept the invitation, but how, what terms to propose, what guarantees to ask for, and who should attend. The question of who should attend was, as it turned out, significant. Ilara Moss, who had demonstrated in the weeks following Harwick's exposure that she was more independent of his influence than Seraphina had been able to assess from a distance, raised it directly. "We need someone who understands the documentation that came out of the Ashfang situation," she said. "Someone who can speak to the specific technical details of the forged authorizations, because Ashfang will want specifics, and generalities will not build trust." "That is Vale," Owen Croft said, from the side of the room where he stood rather than sat, as was his preference. There was a pause around the table. "She is a staff member," said one of the other council members, a man named Philip Greaves, who had the careful, hedging quality of someone who organized his opinions around what was safest. "She is not a diplomatic official. She has no formal standing." "She found the fraud," Owen said. "She documented it. She has the entire chain of evidence in her head as well as on paper. She has a clarity of communication that most of our diplomatic staff would benefit from observing." He paused. "I am not suggesting she lead the delegation. I am suggesting she be part of it." Calum had said very little during this discussion. He had been listening, in the way he always listened, processing rather than reacting. Now he said, "Agreed. She goes." Philip Greaves began to say something. "She goes," Calum said again, with the specific quality of finality that ended discussions in this room. She was told that afternoon. Petra came to the records room and told her, and Serafina looked up from a supply chain comparison and said, "To the Ashfang meeting?" "Yes," Petra said. Serafina put down her pen. She thought about the Ashfang clan and what she knew of them and what she did not know, and she thought about what she would need to prepare, and she thought about the fact that this was a meeting that had the potential to resolve 11 years of tension, and the weight of that was something she felt in her chest as something between responsibility and the specific alertness that came before important work. "When?" she asked. 10 days, Petra said. "You should start reading whatever we have on Ashfang diplomatic history." "I already have," Serafina said. "I read everything in the archives during the first investigation. I will go back through it with new context." Petra looked at her for a moment. "You read everything in the archives." "I was trying to understand the situation completely," Serafina said. "I do not think it is useful to understand pieces of a thing when you can understand the whole." Petra, who had in 8 weeks shifted from flat neutrality to something that occasionally approached warmth, said, 10 days, again, and left. The meeting preparation was the most demanding 10 days Serafina had spent since arriving at the palace. She worked in the records room, she worked in the archives, she worked in the evenings in her room, with notes spread across every available surface. She was not the only person preparing. There was a full diplomatic team, led by a woman named Clara Ward, who had handled 3 previous interpact negotiations, and who was precise and relentless, and who treated Serafina, after the first day, with the specific respect of someone who recognized that the person they had initially categorized as support staff was actually an asset. "When Ashfang raises the question of how the forged documents were created," Clara said, "on the 3rd day of preparation, they will want us to demonstrate that we understand exactly what happened, and that our systems have been updated to prevent it. Can you speak to that?" "Yes," Serafina said, "in detail. Both the technical specifics of the forgery and the changes we have already implemented." "They will push on the internal source," Clara said. "They were told a senior council member was responsible. They will want to understand how a senior council member operated undetected for 11 months. Serafina looked at her. "Shall I tell them the truth?" "Yes," Clara said. "Carefully, but yes. They will respect honesty more than a managed version of the truth." "Then I will tell them the truth," Serafina said. On the 4th day of preparation, in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold, and slanted through the windows of the room they had been using for planning sessions, Calum Drace came in. The room held Clara, Serafina, Owen Croft, and 2 diplomatic staff members. When he entered, the atmosphere changed in the way it always did, not with ceremony, not with people scrambling, but with a subtle recalibration of attention, the room becoming aware of itself in a new way. He went through the preparation plan with Clara for about 20 minutes. He asked specific questions and received specific answers, and Serafina observed, as she had observed from the beginning, the quality of his attention. He did not perform engagement, he was actually engaged. Then he turned to her. "Walk me through the document chain," he said, "the complete sequence, from the original authorization to the diversion point." She did. She had it mapped so well by now that she could do it without notes, and she did, clearly, in order, with all the points at which the chain could have been caught but was not, and the specific changes that had been made to the authorization system to ensure it could not happen again. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 2 questions, both about edge cases she had already considered, and her answers satisfied him. He nodded once. "Good," he said. Then he was about to turn away, and she said, before she could decide whether to say it, "There is one thing that will help more than anything else in this meeting." He paused. "Garrett Cole," she said, "has been running the Ashfang clan for 22 years. He did not come through that by being uncertain. He will be listening for whether we are telling him what we think he wants to hear, or whether we are telling him what is true. The most useful thing we can do in that meeting is never say something we are not certain of, and say clearly when we are uncertain, rather than filling the uncertainty with confident language." There was a brief silence. Clara looked at her, and then at Calum, with the expression of someone watching a thing they had not expected. Calum looked at Serafina and said, "Yes." He said it simply, with the weight of agreement rather than mere acknowledgement. "That is correct." He left. Clara turned to Serafina and looked at her for a moment. "You said that to the Alpha King of Iron Fang," she said. "He asked me to walk him through the document chain," Serafina said. It seemed relevant. "You said it to the Alpha King of Iron Fang," Clara said again. But now the expression on her face was not concern. It was something between amusement and what might have been relief. The Ashfang meeting was held at a neutral location, a small settlement in the border territory between the two packs, a place called Whitfield Cross that had historically functioned as a trading post and had the specific quiet dignity of a place that knew its own purpose. The Iron Fang delegation arrived in the mid-morning of the appointed day. Garrett Cole was already there. He was a gray-haired man, not tall, with the bearing of someone who had earned his authority through decades rather than inheritance, and who wore it accordingly, without performance, without decoration, simply as a fact. He looked at the Iron Fang delegation as they arrived, and Serafina, watching from a respectful distance, had the impression of a man who had already made several assessments and was confirming rather than beginning them. The meeting took 6 hours. She spoke 4 times. Each time was at Clara's indication, and each time she spoke about the documentation, clearly, in the straightforward language that was simply how she communicated, and which Garrett Cole responded to in a visible way, his posture settling slightly, his questions becoming more specific and less careful. He was a man who trusted precision. She was a precise person. They understood each other. The moment she remembered afterward, the one that mattered, came in the 3rd hour. Garrett Cole had asked a direct question about the authorization system change, and Serafina had answered it, and then he had looked at her, not at Clara, not at Calum, and said, "You found this. You found the original discrepancy." "Yes," she said. "You had been in Iron Fang territory 8 weeks." "Yes." "You came as a refugee from a destroyed village." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, to the room in general but still looking at her, "I have been told that good people exist in unexpected places. I am not usually given to finding this sentimental. Today, I am revising that position." Later, in the carriage back to the palace, Clara said it had gone well. She said it in the careful way of someone who did not want to use the word exceptional in case it invited contradiction, but exceptional was what she meant. Serafina sat with her notes in her lap and looked out at the passing land and felt the particular settled feeling of work that had been done well and was, for the moment, finished. She did not look at Calum, who sat across from her in the carriage. She did not need to look at him to know that he was watching her. She had become, in 8 weeks, accustomed to the specific quality of his attention. She looked out at the land and thought about Crestmere, thought about 63 people, thought about what it meant to carry something with you and keep going anyway, not because the loss was small but because the going was what you had. The carriage moved through the cold afternoon. Across from her, the Alpha King of Iron Fang sat in the silence of someone who was arriving at a conclusion he had not been ready for, and was becoming, for the first time, unable to delay it. The trouble did not announce itself. It never did. She had been back from Whitfield Cross for 5 days, when she noticed the new guard outside her corridor. Not the usual rotation, a different man, stationed in a position that covered both her room and the records room, which was not a standard assignment. She noticed it the first morning and did not react. She noticed it the second morning and filed it. By the third morning, she understood that something had shifted in the security arrangement around her specifically, and the question was whether it was protective or restrictive. She found out on the 4th morning, when she arrived at the records room and Aldrich Vane handed her a sealed document without looking up from his own work. She opened it. It was not addressed to her. It was a copy of an internal security alert, dated 2 days prior, and it described a credible threat to a staff member, identified only by their role in the authorization monitoring program. Serafina read it twice, then set it on the desk. "How did you get this?" she asked. "Owen Croft," he said, still not looking up. "He wanted you to be aware, without the formal process of being officially informed." She understood the difference. Being officially informed meant being moved, restricted, managed. Being personally aware meant she could continue working while understanding her situation accurately. What is the source of the threat? She asked. Harwick's former network, Aldrich said. There are several people whose interests were connected to his operations, who are not under restriction, because we could not prove their involvement. One of them has apparently communicated, through a channel that Owen Croft is now monitoring, that a message needs to be sent. She thought about this. A message. Again. The first message had been a substance in her water. The second, she thought, might be something else. What does Owen Croft recommend? She asked. That you do not leave the palace grounds without an escort, Aldrich said, and that you vary your routes within the palace. All right, she said. And that you tell him where you are going, each time, before you go. All right, she said again. He looked up from his work. He looked at her for a moment, in the way that men of his particular breed occasionally looked at people when they wanted to say something they were not sure how to say. You are not afraid, he said. Should I be? She said. I know who the threat is from. I know it is being monitored. I am taking precautions. Fear is useful when you do not have information. When you have information, the information is more useful than the fear. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, in the brief way he had occasionally adopted, and went back to his documents. She went back to work. She varied her routes. She let Owen Croft know her schedule. She did not change the work itself. The work was the work, and there were things in the authorization monitoring system that needed daily attention, and she was not going to let a threat reduce her to someone who spent her time managing the threat, rather than doing what she was there to do. She was careful. She was not cowed. There was a difference. On the 6th day after Whitfield Cross, Calum Drace appeared in the records room for the second time since she had been in the palace. She did not look up immediately. She had learned that looking up immediately when a person entered was a reactive habit that he, in particular, seemed to find somewhat amusing in others, in the subtle way that someone who was not themselves reactive found other people's reflexiveness mildly interesting. She finished the line she was writing and then looked up. He was standing in the center of the room with his hands behind his back. He looked different again. She had been building a catalog of his different looks, not because she was looking, but because she paid attention to people, and he was a person she spent a significant amount of time near. This look was the one she had seen in the carriage, the one that was arriving at something. Aldrich Vane had excused himself within approximately 4 seconds of the Alpha King walking in, with the efficiency of a man who recognized when a room was not his to be in. The door closed. I am aware of the threat situation, she said, before he could say anything, because she wanted him to know that she was not in the dark, and did not need to be brought up to date, and was not frightened. Owen Croft has been thorough. I am taking the recommended precautions. I know, he said. That is not why I came. She looked at him. He looked at her. In this room, in the morning light from the east-facing window that she had specifically chosen her desk to take advantage of, the silver of his eyes was very clear. He was standing close again, closer than he usually stood. She was not sure if he knew he did this. She had not asked. She had observed it. 10 weeks, he said. Yes, she said, because it was approximately accurate. You have been here 10 weeks, and you have, in that time, identified and documented internal financial fraud, prevented an interpack war, developed a monitoring system that has already caught 2 additional irregularities, contributed to a diplomatic meeting that Garrett Cole described afterward as the most productive opening conversation between Ashfang and Ironfang in 15 years, reorganized the medical wing's supply system, and been the subject of not 1 but 2 intimidation attempts from people who want you gone. She looked at him steadily. That is a fair summary. You have done all of this, he said, while being paid a standard staff wage and living in a staff room in the Western Wing. It is a perfectly adequate room, she said. The window faces east. I like that. Something happened in his face, the careful structure of it, the controlled, precise presentation he maintained in every context she had seen him in, shifted again, and this time it shifted further. She saw something under it. She had seen it before, in glimpses. This was not a glimpse. I need to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment. In 10 weeks she had seen him pause before speaking exactly twice. He was not a man who needed to gather himself for words. When he paused, it was because what he was about to say was something he had not said before. I am aware, he said carefully. that I am a person who operates best inside a structure that he controls. I am aware that I have spent 7 years making my life, my work, and this kingdom as close to entirely within my control as anything can be. He paused. I have done this because the alternative, which is the condition in which things are outside your control, is not something I have been comfortable with. She said nothing. She did not look away from him. You are outside my control, he said. In every way. What you do, what you find, what you say to people, what you think. I cannot predict it, cannot manage it, cannot anticipate it. You are the most independent person who has ever been in this palace, and you have been here 10 weeks. He paused again. I find this. He stopped. Yes, she said. Profoundly inconvenient, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, that is possibly the most restrained way anyone has ever described feeling about another person. He looked at her with those silver eyes. I know, he said. She stood up. She was not sure why. She was not sure it was a decision. She simply found herself on her feet, which put her slightly closer to him than the desk between them had been, and she looked at him directly and said, What exactly are you telling me? That I do not know what to do with you, he said. That is not an answer. No, he agreed. It is not. He looked at her with the full, focused, undefended quality of his attention. I have been telling myself, for 10 weeks, that what I am aware of is simply a practical appreciation for exceptional competence in a context where competence is needed. And, she said, and I am no longer able to tell myself that convincingly, he said, because practical appreciation does not produce the specific experience of standing outside a cell door at midnight, watching someone wrap a wolf pup's shoulder, and being entirely unable to make yourself walk away. The room was very quiet. She absorbed this. She thought about the boots she had heard in the corridor, the sound she had felt rather than heard, the feeling she had filed alongside everything else. She said, That was you. Yes, he said. She said, And the lamp on my desk. A pause. Yes. She said, And the reassigned medical staff. I had already been thinking about that, he said, with a slight defensiveness that was the closest thing to it she had ever seen from him. You made me think about it faster. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something had become different in this room. She could feel the edges of it, the way you could feel the edges of a change in temperature. Not sharp, but definite. Definite in a way that was not going to become indefinite again. I do not know what I am, in terms of this world, she said. I have no wolf, no pack, no rank. I came here in chains. I have been here 10 weeks, and I have done good work, and I am glad of it, but I am still. She paused, searching for the right word. None of that matters, he said, flatly, definitively, with the same tone he used to end discussions in the council room. None of it has ever mattered to me. She took a breath. He took a breath. I am not sure what comes next, she said. Neither am I, he said. That is new for me. She almost smiled at that. She did not fully smile, because the moment was too serious for that, but she felt the edge of it. Is it frightening? She asked. The not knowing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the honesty of someone who was very unused to being honest about this particular category of feeling, somewhat. Yes, she thought about that. She thought about a man who had built a kingdom around himself, and built control around the kingdom, who had been certain of everything for so long that uncertainty had become the one condition he had no practice with. She thought about what it had taken for him to walk into this room and say what he had said. You should know, she said, that I am also uncertain about what I am here, what I am building, what this life is going to be. I came here with nothing, and I have been constructing something out of the available materials, but I do not have a clear picture of the complete structure yet. I know, he said. So we are both uncertain, she said. Yes, he said. Then we are in the same position, she said. Which is probably, in the end, the most honest place to start anything. He looked at her for a long time, and then, for the first time in the 10 weeks she had known him, in the corridor or the council room or the carriage or this room, Calum Drace allowed his expression to do something entirely uncontrolled. It was not large, it was quiet, but it was the most real thing she had seen from him, and it was unmistakable. Relief. Not happiness, not yet. But the specific thing that came before it. The putting down of something that had been very heavy. She felt it in her own chest, answering. Outside, down the corridor, a large silver wolf put his nose against a gap in a far door, and did not come through it, because there was no reason to intervene in what was already becoming true. There was no announcement. She had expected, not exactly fanfare, but some formal indication of what had shifted. A meeting, a document, something that suited the organized, deliberate way that Calum Drace managed everything in his life. What she got instead was simply his continued presence. Not in the records room. The visit to the records room had been unusual, and remained so. But in the corridors, in the working meetings he began including her in the dining room, where he had previously always eaten with senior counsel, and began, once, eating at the larger communal table where she sat, surrounded by staff who went very still, and then very deliberately pretended not to notice. She noticed that they noticed. She did not say anything about it. The council noticed. The people who had been in the room when he had ended a discussion about her status with a flat declarative had been watching since, and they were watching more closely now. Some of them adjusted their behavior toward her, not dramatically, but in the small ways that indicated a recalibration of who she was in relation to the power structure of this place. Philip Greaves, who had been the one to raise the question of her staff status at the Ashfang preparation meeting, now asked her questions in a tone that expected useful answers. Ilara Moss had always treated her with professional respect, and continued to do so, but it was warmer now. Owen Croft treated her exactly as he always had, which was with the direct, uncomplicated acknowledgement of a man who assessed competence, and did not much care about anything else. The threat from Harwick's former network was resolved in the third week after the records room conversation, when Owen Croft's monitoring identified the source and the person was taken into custody. Serafina was informed of this through Petra, briefly and efficiently, and went back to work. She went back to work, but the work was different now. Not in its content. The records still needed organizing. The authorization monitoring still needed running. The medical wing still needed the 2 evenings a week she gave it. But the context around the work had changed, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she felt it. Felt it in the way she moved through the palace. Felt it in the way she sat in planning meetings and said what she thought without measuring it first. She had always been direct, but there was a difference between the directness of someone who was not sure they had permission and the directness of someone who understood, at a deep level, that they were where they were supposed to be. The wolf, Ash, had continued to grow. He was enormous by now, which had apparently not surprised anyone except Serafina, who had not known enough about wolves to understand that the size of a wolf was in some way connected to things she had not yet been told. Gretchen had looked at him one afternoon in the medical wing, where he had followed Serafina on one of her evening sessions, and said, "He is a king's wolf." Serafina had looked up from the supply cabinet. "What does that mean?" "The largest wolves are always the closest to the most dominant bloodlines," Gretchen said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for information that she considered known. "A wolf that size, growing up attached to a person without a wolf, that is unusual." "Is it a problem?" Serafina asked. "No," Gretchen said. "It is a question. It is saying something about you that you probably do not yet have the language for." Serafina had thought about this afterward. She thought about it the way she thought about all things she did not yet fully understand, with patient, organized attention, leaving space for more information to arrive. More information arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a conversation with Calum that had not been planned. She was walking in the eastern courtyard at dawn. She had begun doing this, the walking in the early morning, because she had found that thinking moved differently in open air than in a room, and he was there already, which surprised her, because his usual practice was the training grounds on the western side. They walked together for a while without speaking. This was, she had found, something they were both capable of, the comfortable absence of speech, which was different from the uncomfortable kind, and required a specific quality of relationship to produce. Eventually he said, "Has anyone explained to you what it means that your wolf chose you?" She looked at him. Not fully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A wolf that chooses a person without a pack affiliation, and without their own wolf, is making a claim." In the oldest understanding of wolf behavior, this is recognized as the wolf identifying that person as pack, not a specific pack, not a formed social unit, but something more fundamental. something about the person themselves. He paused. It is rare. Gretchen suggested something similar, she said. There is a reason the wolf pup was in this part of the palace, he said. Wolves in my household come from the same breeding lines as my own wolf. They are not separate from the pack structure. They are part of it. He looked at her. For a wolf from my household to have chosen you means that in the language of that structure, you have been recognized as something. She thought about this carefully. Recognized as what? He was quiet for a longer moment. They had stopped walking without deciding to, standing in the gray dawn light of the courtyard, and the morning was cold and quiet around them, and she could see her own breath and his. I have not been certain until recently, he said, about how to say this. I have been more certain about certain things than I am usually uncertain about, and less able to name them than I usually find naming things. That is a complicated sentence, she said. Yes, he said. I know. I am attempting to navigate a situation that does not have a precedent in my experience. She waited. My wolf, he said, with the specific deliberateness of a man who had thought about how to say this for a long time, and was finally saying it, has not been in my control in the way that he usually is, since approximately the third week you were here. He does not, when you are in the vicinity, he does not behave as he usually does. He is, a pause, insistent. She looked at him. He looked at her. I see, she said. I am not sure you do yet, he said, but you will. She thought about the word Gretchen had not said. She thought about the old stories she had grown up with in Crestmere, told around fires in the winter, about bonds that were not chosen but recognized, not built but discovered, and what that meant in the world that wolves understood, and humans sometimes glimpsed. She thought about Ash, about a wolf from a royal household pressing his chin against her knee in a cell. She thought about boots in a corridor at midnight. I think, she said slowly, that I am beginning to understand. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, I think you are. The morning kept going around them. A bird crossed the sky above the courtyard. The cold air moved between them. What does it mean for us? She asked. Practically. I do not know completely, he said. I have never been in this situation. Neither have I, she said. We established that. We established that, he agreed. And something in his expression did the quiet, real thing again. The putting down of something heavy. But it seems to me that two people who are both uncertain and both honest about it are in a better position than most. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It does seem that way. They stood in the courtyard until the morning was fully bright, not talking about very much, which was one of the most significant things she had experienced in a long time. The Ashfang formal treaty signing happened 3 weeks later, in Whitfield Cross, and it was attended by most of the senior council, and a larger delegation than the initial meeting. Garrett Cole shook hands with Calum Drace, and then, to the quiet astonishment of everyone watching, turned to Seraphina and said, Without you, this would not have happened. He said it plainly, in the way he said everything. She said, equally plainly, without the honesty of both packs, it would not have happened. I only described what was true. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way decisive men nodded when they had decided something, and moved on. In the carriage back, Clara said, very quietly, that was 11 years of tension ending. Yes, Seraphina said. Because of work you did in the first 8 weeks of being here. Because of work a great many people did, Seraphina said. I found a starting point. Other people did the rest. Clara looked at her. Then she looked at Calum, who was looking at Seraphina, with the expression that the carriage by now had seen several times. Clara looked back at her documents and said nothing further, but the slight curve at the corner of her mouth suggested that she had filed certain observations for future consideration. Seraphina looked out the window at the land moving past. She thought about starting points, about where you found them, and what they led to, and the way that the starting point rarely looked like one when you were standing in it. Crestmere had been a starting point. She had not known it at the time. She had simply been surviving it. She had been surviving a great deal of things, for a long time, and in the middle of the surviving, something had been building, not despite the difficulty but alongside it, the way certain plants grew specifically in ground that had been broken and turned and left open to the weather. She had not planned any of this. She had come to Iron Fang territory looking only for shelter, and she had found something that was not a plan, and was not an expectation, and was not, she thought now, quite a surprise either. It was more like recognition, the specific experience of arriving somewhere and finding that the shape of the place matched a shape you had been carrying, without knowing you carried it. Outside, the land of Iron Fang territory moved past, gray and cold and real, and she kept looking at it. And in the seat across from her, the Alpha King was doing the same quiet, arriving at the same conclusion that he had been moving toward since a girl from a destroyed village had stood in his throne room and not looked away. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. The carriage moved through the afternoon, and the territory stretched out around them, and something that had been beginning for a long time was simply, now, begun. She did not see it coming. In the week before the winter solstice celebration, the largest formal gathering in the Iron Fang calendar, an event that filled the palace with every person of significance in the territory and their extended circles, something changed in the atmosphere of the palace that she could not immediately name. She noticed it in the way she noticed everything. Small things. The extra time the tailoring staff spent in consultation when she passed them in the corridor. The way Petra arrived on a Monday morning with a dress wrapped carefully in cloth that was not for staff dinners. The way Owen Croft, when she asked him why the Great Hall was being set up 3 days earlier than she would have expected, looked at her with the specific blankness of a man who knew something he had been asked not to share. She asked Calum directly, which was by now how she handled things she needed to understand. "What is happening?" she said, when she found him in the working room on Wednesday morning. He looked at her. "The solstice celebration," he said. "I know about the solstice celebration," she said. "I have been helping coordinate the supply orders for the past 2 weeks. I am asking about the additional something. The thing that is happening that is not the standard event." He was quiet for a moment. "Something I have been considering," he said. "Something I want to do. And you are not going to tell me." "I am going to tell you," he said, "on the night." She looked at him. She had spent enough time with him to read the outlines of what he was not saying. She thought about the way the tailoring staff had behaved. She thought about the dress. She thought about everything she had accumulated in these months, that she had filed under the category of what is happening here, and not yet been able to fully answer. "All right," she said. She let it go. She was good at letting things go, when they needed to be let go, holding them lightly in the peripheral awareness that she brought to everything, and trusting that they would resolve when they resolved. The solstice evening arrived on a night that was the coldest so far that season, the kind of cold that had a texture to it, that you could feel on your face like a fabric. The Great Hall had been transformed, and while Serafina had been helping coordinate the supply side of that transformation, actually standing inside the result was different from knowing about it. The hall was lit with hundreds of candles, and the warm smell of pine and spice filled everything. The people who filled it were dressed in the best things they owned, which in Iron Fang meant things that were worth looking at. She wore the dress Petra had brought. It was a deep gray, nearly blue, the color of winter sky, at an hour before dark, and it fit in the way that things only fit when someone has measured carefully and thought about the result. She had not asked who paid for it. She thought she knew. She moved through the hall in the first hour of the evening, doing what she naturally did, talking to people, listening, noting things that seemed important, and setting aside things that did not. She spoke to Clara about the Ashfang Treaty implementation timeline. She spoke to Gretchen, who had come in a vivid red dress and looked remarkable and entirely aware of it. She spoke to Gerald from the document receiving office, who was very pleased with the changes to the intake system and who thanked her for the 3rd time since those changes had been implemented. She spoke to Aldrich Vane, who had appeared in a jacket that was cleaner than any jacket she had ever seen him wear, and who told her, with his characteristic directness, that the Eastern region's supply documentation was now in the best condition it had been in since the year before his predecessor retired, which was apparently a significant compliment. She noticed when Calum entered the hall. She was not watching the door. She did not need to be. Something about the way the room recalibrated when he was in it reached her wherever she was. He went through the hall greeting people in the specific way that was efficient rather than warm, but which everyone nonetheless received as sufficient, because it was real. He was real in everything he did. That, she had come to understand, was one of the things about him that she looked for the word, valued. Yes, that was still the right word. She would not claim more than she was certain of, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She was standing near the far windows when he made his way to her. Not in a straight line, he moved through the hall naturally, stopping where stopping was expected, speaking where speaking was called for. But the direction was consistent, and she watched it, and she felt the thing that had been building in her since a working room conversation in the gray dawn, which was not quite an answer yet, but was close to one. He stopped beside her at the window. "You look different," he said. "It is the dress," she said. "It is not only the dress," he said. She looked at him. He was in the formal clothes that Iron Fang kings wore for occasions like this, dark and precise and entirely suited to him, and he was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her for weeks, which was the way you looked at things that you had decided were yours without having formally said so. "What did you want to do?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The hall moved around them. Hundreds of people, the warm light, the scent of pine and candles. She was aware of being seen. People noticed where the Alpha King stood, and they would notice who he stood beside. "I want to say something to you," he said, in a room full of people who need to hear it. She held his gaze. "Because I am the Alpha King of Iron Fang," he said, "and I have operated this territory for 7 years, on the principle that what I say and what I do are consistent. I do not do things privately that I am not willing to do publicly. I do not feel things privately that I am not willing to acknowledge publicly." He paused. "And I am aware that this is a thing I need to say in a room full of my people, because my people need to understand who you are." She felt the edge of what was coming, not in a frightening way, in the way that you sometimes felt the shape of a thing before you could see it fully. "Then say it," she said. He turned to face her fully. Around them, the hall did not go quiet. Too many people, too much sound. But something in the immediate space around them did. The people nearest them had noticed. They were noticing very carefully. "You came to this place with nothing," he said. "You stood in my hall in chains, and you told the truth, when most people would have told whatever they thought I wanted to hear. In 8 weeks, you found what my council could not find in 11 months. In 10 weeks, you helped close a diplomatic gap that had been open for 11 years. You were threatened, and you were not afraid, and you were uncertain, and you did not pretend otherwise, and you are the most precisely yourself person I have ever encountered, and you have no idea what that means, in a world full of people who perform everything." She was looking at him. He was looking at her. "I know what you are to me," he said. "My wolf has known since the 3rd week. I have been catching up." The space around them was very still now. The hall moved on, but there was a circle of attention. People who had noticed without being pointed at noticing, who were watching in the careful sideways way that people watch things they understand to be significant. She took a breath. "And what am I?" she said. He said the word, not loudly, not performed, exactly as simply and as completely as it deserved to be said. "Mine." Then, doing the thing she had not expected, doing the thing that no one in the hall had expected, that people would describe differently in their accounts of it afterward, but would agree on in the essential point, he stepped forward. Not to tower over her, not to command or arrange. He stepped forward, and then, in a gesture that was not a bow, and was not a kneel, in the political sense, but was something older and more specific, he lowered his head very slightly toward her. The submission of a wolf to what his wolf recognized. She looked at him. She felt something open in her chest that had been closed for so long she had stopped noticing the closing. She did what felt true. She put her hand against the side of his face. One hand, gently, the way you touched something you were not going to let go of, and he went very still under it, and she felt the exhale that moved through him like something being released from a very long holding. The hall was not quiet, but the people near them had stopped pretending they were not watching. Ash was there. He had come in at some point, large and silver, somewhere to her left, because he went where she went, and had for months, and no one had found a way to argue with it. He looked at the Alpha King, and the Alpha King looked at him, and something passed between them that was not a human thing, and therefore had no human language, but which resolved into a new stillness in both of them. She felt, for the first time since Crestmere, that she was entirely in the right place. Not because the place was perfect, not because everything was resolved. There was still the Harwick hearing to get through, still the formalization of the Ashfang Treaty, still the 1,000 daily works of running a kingdom that had not stopped needing to be done, not because she had arrived somewhere finished. but because she had arrived. Calum raised his head and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the hall of Iron Fang continued around them, warm and lit and full of people who were understanding something, in their various ways, about who stood in the center of it. She said, quietly, only to him, "You commanded my execution." "Yes," he said. "Before everyone," she said. "Yes," he said. "And now this," she said. "Yes," he said. "Before everyone." She thought about that. She thought about the shape of a story, how a beginning that looked like an ending could become the actual beginning of the thing that mattered. She thought about what it meant to be brought to a place in chains, and to find, in the middle of the fear of it, that you were not going to break. To work your way, through honesty and patience and the simple commitment to doing what needed doing, into the exact center of a life you had not known to want. She had not planned this. She had not planned any of it. She had only kept going, and kept being herself, and kept doing the next right thing, and the next right thing, and the next right thing after that. "I have a condition," she said. He looked at her with the slight wariness of a man who was not used to conditions. "What condition?" "That you always tell me the truth," she said, "even when it is inconvenient, especially when it is inconvenient." He looked at her steadily. "I have never told you anything that was not true." "I know," she said. "I want it to stay that way." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I have an equal condition?" "Name it," she said. "That you stop managing things alone," he said. "That you bring me the problem when there is a problem, instead of solving it completely before I know it exists." She thought about this. "That is a significant adjustment for someone with my habits," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I will try," she said. "I will try also," he said. They stood in the center of the great hall of Iron Fang, on the longest night of the year, the two of them with their agreed imperfections and their honest intentions, surrounded by hundreds of people who would need to understand what they had seen, and who would eventually, in the way that people did, find their way to the understanding. And Ash sat at her feet like a silver mountain, unbothered by any of it, because wolves did not need the world to understand them. They simply knew what they knew, and went where they went, and waited, with the patient certainty of something that had always been sure, for the humans to catch up. The candles burned. The great hall moved. The winter night stretched out beyond the windows, cold and clear and full of stars. She looked at Calum Drace, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything further, because the words were, for the moment, finished, and what remained did not need them. It was enough. It was, for the first time in a long time, exactly enough.